Great to see you all. Welcome to today's program. I'm Randy Isaac, our host for the American Scientific Affiliation, and we're pleased on this program on July 10, 2021, to discuss an article from the June 2021 issue of the Perspectives on Science and Christian Faith. And we selected a specific article entitled Rethinking Abiogenesis, which is part 2, Life as Simplification of the Non-Living Universe. And we're delighted to have one of the authors with us, Steve Freeland. And Steve, I'm particularly happy to welcome you to this program, particularly since last night it was revealed that you've been elected as an ASA Fellow, among others. This will be officially announced at the end of the month, but I broke protocol here, and John is shaking his head here. But this is great. Steve, it's very well deserved. Really thank you and welcome you into the fellow mold. And that will take place officially at the annual meeting. So, Steve, if you could unmute yourself, then there you go. Okay, so Steve, you're our new fellow, but I suspect that there are a number of people here who don't know that much about you. So let's start a little bit from the beginning. Where are you from, Steve?
Hi, Randy. Hi, everybody. I am deeply honored that you'd all bother to be here. And I just want to say what a sincere honor it was to hear about the fellowship. Thank you. What did you say? Where am I from? I'm British. I am British. I sound Australian now because I've been here in America for 21 years. But I was born in Kent, south of London.
Okay. And I suppose you got your education in England then?
I did. And I just realized it must be nerves. I'm crazy. I was actually born in Kenya, but I spent most of my childhood.
Wait a minute.
Yeah.
Kent, what's the difference between Kent and Kenya? Just Kenya. The letters. Oh, my word.
I was only there for 6 months, so my childhood was Kent. But I was not born there.
Fascinating.
Sorry, tell me again. What was your next question? I flustered myself.
Well, when I thought you were born in Kent instead of Kenya, I assumed that you must have gotten your education in England. Is that correct?
I did, and that all my childhood, yes. So
all right,
it was definitely the county of Kent. Yes.
Okay, and where did you end up going to Cambridge?
Actually, my undergrad was to Oxford, and that just blew my mind. We were from a small town. I'm a preacher's kid. So it was a scholarship place, and I'd never been anywhere so exotic in all my life. It was so wonderful to be in such a physically beautiful place, but around such interesting minds. Yes.
So you must have gotten to Cambridge sometime here. So
I did. That was my PhD.
After Oxford, right? Yeah. Okay. You got your PhD over there. So what fields were you in undergrad?
Yeah, so it sounds really confusing, doesn't it? I think Jim made this point, but the undergrad was zoology, the master's was computer science and mathematics for biology, and the PhD was genetics. But the funny thing is, it was really always the same underlying questions that were interesting me. Yep.
Oh, fascinating. Well, you most people here may know that you really made your mark in the discovery of an alternative genetic code. Was that part of your graduate work or postgrad, or how did that come about?
Yeah, it was the second project that my PI put me on as a PhD student. To be fair, it was nothing as exotic as discovering an alternate genetic code. It was discovering a pattern that seemed informative within the code that we know so well. And that was my second project. And I guess it's sort of, I have a lot of empathy with people, one-hit wonders or whatever, right? Because as a PhD student, we had this explosion of interest in that finding. And, I'm still asking related questions. It's the same theme, but nothing quite as much, nothing that's achieved quite so much interest as that first paper.
Yeah, I'll bet. Yeah. What are there now? 30 some alternate codes have been identified somewhere in there. I mean, that's really incredible. You really got in on the ground floor of that. So that's super. But what drew you to the field of genetics? Why did you go into that?
I think I could be honest. God, maybe. I hated biochemistry and molecular biology as an undergrad. I thought I wanted to study, speciation and shell patterns and all of that beautiful stuff.
Right.
I did anything I could as an undergrad to avoid biochemistry, mathematics, and I think my master's degree was a pivot point in that, finding that the beauty that interested me was there. And then it was the PhD project that got me started on the code and eventually turned into a career, much to my surprise.
Excellent. All right. So your career obviously didn't stay at Cambridge. How did you cross the pond?
A postdoctoral opportunity. And it was my first North American conference, was at the tail end of my PhD, and still really talking about that first finding. But it generated a lot of positive energy. And I was offered a postdoctoral place at Princeton for 3 months, during which I could apply to find ways to extend it, and was very blessed to receive a way to extend it to almost 3 years at Princeton, 2.5 years. And so that was a postdoctoral fellowship, at the end of which, choosing Maryland, which is where you find me today, although there have been some twists and turns along the way.
Okay. Yeah, weren't you in Hawaii a little bit?
I was 4 years in Hawaii. Very, very different job.
Tough life. Hawaii, yeah.
Do you know what? For those who don't know it, actually, watch out. Oahu is a place to work. It is a tough place. It's a great place to vacation, but the traffic is awful, and it was a real wake up to what Hawaii is and isn't. And anyone who's been there will know what I mean. Yep.
Yeah. But for the rest of you, the reason I know this is that we did get Steve to come and speak at the 2012 ASA annual meeting in San Diego, and it's clear that Steve was flying from Hawaii. I think you were actually moving back from Hawaii at that time, or shortly thereafter. So that's his first major interaction with the ASA, and since then he's spoken at several annual meetings and contributed quite a bit. So we really appreciate that. But before we really get into the nuts and bolts of the article, Steve, can you comment a little bit on your faith background? How were you raised from your religious perspective?
Okay, so Dad was actually originally a biology teacher, but had felt called to the ministry as I was arriving on the scene. So I only ever knew him as a Methodist minister. And for the early years, that was it. You know, it's sort of we went to see him on Sunday do his thing. Anyone else out there who's a preacher's kid, you know, your house is sort of a revolving door to endless activities around. But then at the age of 10, he took on a chaplaincy at a girls' school. And so I started going to the village church instead of going where he was. And that, it was Pembury Free Church. And I'm trying to remember which particular denominations it was crossed over with. It gets very complicated. But the bottom line is it was a strongly evangelical church. Yes, and I mean, amongst other things, that was where I sort of first encountered creationism, and was quite sympathetic to it as a teenager. But then off to university, and we all know how that changes. Sort of. Really?
Yeah.
Is that enough, or is it?
Well, the only just slight twist on that I would like to is, so did you kind of get into university now seeing conflicts on science and faith, or was that never a major issue for you?
It never was for me. I found it so interesting for a while, but really a lot of it was under my own steam. But Dad had always raised me to assume alignment and say the challenge is to look for what that actually means. So yes, I've been very blessed on that. Thank you. That's
right. So now you kind of have I guess the genetic code helped move you into origin of life kind of work, and so let's talk about this article a little bit. How'd you come to write this particular article that we're discussing today? Is a quick sudden brainstorm? Has this been something you've been thinking about for a while? How did this happen?
Honestly, something I've been thinking about for a while, and I remember distinctly a talk at Biologos, which was really about astrobiology and the propensity of the universe to bring forth life. And during the Q&A, and I'd love to know if it's someone here, I'd love to know who it was, somebody was picked up on a note of order from chaos and said, oh, that's interesting, I'd love to hear more about that. And it became a sort of 2-year commitment to get to that point. But in the process of writing, and all those here who publish, I think you know, don't you, that in the process of writing, it matures. Writing and thinking go hand in hand. So there are definitely elements of the way it's written that reflect deeper thought in the process of writing. Not least the help of Randy and Emily in being there and complimentary. And here today, I can only really represent 1/3 of the authorship, right? But
well, not really. I think we can all understand that. But let me just comment on Emily. She sends her regrets to everyone that she couldn't join. She's a remarkable young lady, contributed a lot here, and has devoted her life. She's now in a intern in chaplaincy with the Episcopalian Church, I believe it is, right? So she's doing, isn't it the Yale study of religion, I think. I forgot the exact name. But at any rate, she's a bright young lady, and she'll do well. And she sends all of you her greetings, but she contributed a lot. And I don't know the third author. I think that'll come to play later. But at any rate, clearly, this is something you've been thinking about a long time. And before we move into the questions directly, is there one message or something that you'd like all of the readers of your article, all the listeners here today, to come away with? If they don't remember anything else, what should they remember from this article?
You'd think I would have prepared that better, wouldn't you?
Yeah, because I asked you.
You did. The trouble is, it's hard to think what this single line is, and I think it is this, that understand I'm coming from a particular perspective even within my community, but I believe that the present exciting abiogenesis research and the near future exciting for that field is looking at order out of chaos, which is a subtle paradigm shift for the field, I think. I think if you go back far enough, there was an implied or explicit feeling that abiogenesis was all about achieving something more complex than the non-living universe. And although there are ways, and we can explore those in the questions, there are ways that is fair, I think that paradigm has walked a long way and has accidentally forgotten that it's equally obvious the origin of life is a order from chaos. And the way we choose to talk about that is simplification.
Okay, that's great. So let's move into the audience discussion. So Becky, if you'll allow people to unmute themselves, we're going to start with those who submitted their questions in advance. They get the first row. There are 5, I believe, who submitted questions in advance, and we'll give them the first chance. And after that, we'll take in order those who find a way to raise their hand. So first one who submitted something is David Tom. Dave, I see you over there. So you are able to connect. And of the, what was it, about 1,000 questions you put in? It seemed like it. But if you could just pick one of those and ask this at this time, you do have to unmute yourself, David. It helps us a lot if you unmute. You can't do that. Sign language. I don't think we have a sign language interpreter here.
Right.
There you go. All right, Dave. Welcome here.
I thought Steve would be lecturing us a while before questions came up. So.
Well, that's what you do in your meetings, Dave. You know, my meeting is a little different.
Okay. All right. Give me a minute here. All right. All right. Here we go. Here's my question. Steve, this comes from. You mind if I read the part that you wrote and then I'll question it?
Perfect. Thank you so much, Dave.
Okay. From the perspective of life as simplification, we can observe that many corners of the universe exist where a throughput of energy leads to material chemical simplification. Energy from sunlight can distill fresh water from salty oceans, and energy from Brownian motion can cause a crystal comprising one type of molecule to accrete layers of itself from a complex aqueous solution. In each case, a careful observer can frame the process as one of simplification within an environment of greater complexity. In both cases, it is clear that components and processes are a part of a seamless whole. Crystallization and evaporation are processes that reflect the complex whole environment in which they occur, in the sense that a few key aspects of complex environment produces the phenomena. From this perspective, life clearly aligns itself with non-life. My question is, have you thought to distinguish the ordered from the complex? Salt water can break down from fresh water, ? Then through evaporation, yes. Though I did find this, and I found something else. But anyway, crystallization isn't complex, nor is evaporation. You put it in a category of complexity, but it's just not complex. It's a breakdown or a buildup of orderliness, i.e. snowflakes are not complex. When the toilet flushes and swirls, it's not complexity, it's orderliness. When something collapses into a chromosome or distills into a protein, then you have the paper written for you. Without being a Darwinist, I'd suggest that this hint, if it can't mutate, it probably is a product of organism. It will always behave the same way under the same pressure that you put under it. It might not. Can it also mutate? Then you have complexity. In fact, you probably will have life. And once dead, organically, it's probably subject to organisms. I just thought of that. I'm not sure that that's really true. Seems to make sense to me. So dead stuff is no longer going to mutate. Dead stuff can't pass on life, but you think that it does. Okay, that's my question.
All right.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I mean, there is a lot going on there, and I would love this to be dialogue. I talk too much, just ask my students or my wife. So the idea of not lecturing is so that we engage in dialogue and listen to each other. I think there will be more questions that will point out that there are different uses of these dangerously intuitive words like complexity. I think let me just start with something in what you were saying there. Maybe I misread it or misheard it this time, but I want to be clear that my argument is that life is like the crystal in the sense that it is simpler, that it is the exterior that is complex, and it is life that, at least in some ways, is the ordered state that you're talking. I agree completely. And so we're calling ordered simple in a very limited sense. And I think maybe I should say less now and let other questions unravel this, that those words are dangerous because they do have different meanings to different people, even different research meanings in different subfields. Our argument is that within abiogenesis, at least, there is a sort of careless conflation of ordered with complex, not a careful matching of the two. And it does have a careful meaning. But we wanted to focus on the ways that keep getting overlooked in which life is simpler than the non-living environment. And to say it really is that process of ordering that is what we're interested in. I was going to say one more thing because I don't think I articulated that very well, but I don't want this to go on too long. Older chemistry experiments, and you can still find them today, that argue that they are of direct relevance to abiogenesis. The older ones often are trying to force into existence something that they find that is desirable from the perspective of getting life. And they tend to really underplay the importance of randomness, chaos, disorder as the environment from which to get there. So very often you will find these experiments which limit their reagents and perform in sort of distilled water in order to show a reaction pathway that produces something. And they would sort of say, well, yes, you need to control this hugely to be able to get the meaningful experiment. But we're like, but we all agree that wasn't what life came from. Life came from disorder. And when we look at life in certain well-defined, measurable ways, it's clearly a filtered product of that disorder that is what we're after. And there's a different kind of experiment that has to address that, right?
Okay. That's great. I think we're going to have a lot more questions about that, but it's clearly a different perspective that you're offering here, a different way to think. Let's cover some of the other questions that came in advance and in our open discussion.
I haven't owned up to you. I've got 5 young children, 2 of whom in particular keep opening the door, and I just want to close it again so I can hear you properly. I'll be right back. Okay.
Okay. All right. That's fine. Randy Smith, you'll be next here, and following that, Del Kuhn. Let's see, are you on? I haven't. Yeah, there you are. Okay, I see. Okay, so Del, you'll be third one, and we'll give it from there. So I think. Okay, here we go. So Marika, we'll get you after Del Kuhn, and then John Wood. Okay, Randy Smith.
Hello. Thank you so much for taking my question, Steve and Randy. I think I'll do like Dave and just read my question here. That's all right. I said...
just keep it short. We have a lot of people who want to ask questions. So.
Okay.
Yeah, that's good.
So if I understand the claim correctly, an analogy is proposed that since the fundamental biochemistry of living matter is simpler than the atomic composition of the various elements of non-living matter. Life is uncomplicated from kind of a biological nuclear physics perspective. I was just curious about, I just read a book by Augustine, and he distinguishes simplicity and complexity by what exists, and then what is alive, and then what understands. And I was wondering if you could comment on the appropriateness of expanding the idea of simplicity and complexity to include potential metaphysical aspects of existence. Thank you.
I mean, it was a wonderful question. It was beautifully worded. I don't mean this to come over wrong, but the first thing I've got to say is probably no. I should probably go to people who study consciousness to give you a meaningful answer to your question about those higher levels, who think theologically, spiritually, and psychologically. It's clearly related, isn't it? I was just at a workshop last week where it was more about direction within multicellular life, but there were people there talking about the advent of consciousness. And there are noticeable echoes, aren't there, with abiogenesis and then a sort of higher order transition. And it was so interesting listening to them, but realizing that their rules are slightly different and that I'm no expert there. The first part of your question, I just think it was, for me, was one of the more exciting discoveries in writing. And I hope it doesn't bore people if I just go back to what you said. We'd contrasted Richard Dawkins talking about a star as simple and life as complex. And I must admit, I read that as an undergrad, and I was like, well, obviously, but I was a biologist. And the epiphany was to realize it's a question of perspective, isn't it? I don't claim that life isn't complex. And I don't claim that complexity science can't get at really interesting aspects of life. But I think it has become dangerously over important, that one perspective, in abiogenesis, relative to remembering the other perspective that we're talking about, the idea of extracting less from more. Yeah, there is complexity, and in many ways it is a rhetorical device to remind us that that is also, you can count ways and show ways and point at ways in which it involves a direct simplification. And that's the part that seems to have gotten so overlooked. Does that have cognates when it comes to consciousness and even spirituality? I think just the wisest part of me says, let's find somebody who can speak to that directly, because I don't want to be that guy who thinks that just because I'm thinking over here on this corner, I've got something useful to say over there, right? But I hope that's not disappointing, Randy. I mean, may I ask you for a reaction to that, Randy? Other Randy, is that okay?
Sure. Yeah, that's good. That's good. It's kind of out of your lane. My question was kind of a philosophical question, but I was just curious what your response was.
Well, may I jump in here a little bit? Is in the process of writing and rewriting many times this manuscript, we as authors had a lot of discussion here in terms of, and I was confused about this for quite a while, are we talking about simplification as a process or as an outcome? And Steve convinced me that it's both, and that puzzled me. I couldn't understand that for quite a while, and I wasn't really on board with his paper until that worked out. And yes, there's a sense in which simplification is a process, that the very existence of life is a simpler subset, a selection of from a more complex environment. And it's also an outcome. There's a sense in which it is. Now, a lot of reactions have been people saying, "Oh, look how horribly complex life is. You can't tell me that's simpler than a rock or something." But Steve has really opened my eyes a little bit, saying, "Well, you have to think about these in other dimension and other terms." And I am still trying to get my head around it, but I see some value in pursuing this. If I may, I shouldn't interrupt you.
Let me be bold and say this is one place where, I don't want Randy or Emily to feel responsible for the strength of what I'm going to say, but I do believe that no matter how complex life is, if you could really see the environment and then remember all the past environments that have also contributed to the life part that you're now looking at, it is more complex.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And well, it's something to discuss later a little bit as well. But let's move on to Del Kuhn, and then Marika will be later after that. Del?
Randy, thank you. And Steve, thank you for the articles. Articles plural. I really enjoyed reading through them and appreciate the insights I've got from reading it. Hopefully I'll understand them someday. I'd like to pick up on two themes. One is the interaction of organisms and the environment to mutually influence each other. And the second is the order out of chaos. For background, Stephen Jay Gould in Wonderful Life suggests that if evolution were a tape that could be rewound and replayed, it would come out differently each time. So as a thought experiment, my question is, if God were more like a deist than the involved creator he is, what's the sort of thing that evolution might have come out differently that's at least intellectually honest to believe in? And I do not mean anything like out of the gaps or we don't know that it must have been God. So crudely, what difference has God made?
I want to thank you for such a deep question, and to say first up, this is why it is such a joy to be a part of ASA, is so that I can listen to theologians, philosophers, and other thinkers who can educate me in places where I'm no expert. But your question was a good, deep one, and the only reflection I can really, or the reflection that came to me that I want to stay with, one could ask, by analogy, if God were a deist within the confines of my lifespan, didn't actually have a hands-on direct interference between the fertilization of sperm and egg and the adult that I am now and whoever I'll be the day I die, does that stop God from being a theist, that I can't pinpoint places where God intervened? And if the answer is no, God can still be a theist, it's that delicate touch that we sometimes would struggle to distinguish through science, then I would apply that same argument to the history of life, not just to the history of my life. Does that make sense, Dean, as a response?
Del.
Sorry, Del. I'm so sorry.
Trying to figure out how to work a computer. It makes sense. I don't want to throw anything and make any suggestions, but yes, it makes sense that none of us think that God is an alternative explanatory mechanism like science is. That's, I think, a slander that too many Christians have bought into. On the other hand, I almost feel like going back and saying either the whole thing or can we really say anything? I don't want to coin a term like a Christian anthropomorphic principle or anthropic principle, but I think there are things that obviously would be different if God hadn't done it. Maybe they're subtle, like cyanobacteria and oxygen, to make sure there was a metabolic pathway that could support brains to let us interact with God. But and I'm not a theologian. As a layperson in the pews, yes, I think God is always there in everything. On the other hand, it's a little bit a letdown at the end to say that, well, yeah, we, as a scientific explanation, we really don't need him anyway. I don't know whether there's an answer. That's why I asked the question, to get your insights and hopefully other insights on the rest of the webinar.
And again, don't let me dominate, but you know what occurs to me as you say it that way. Do I believe that my life would have turned out differently if God hadn't been reaching in and touching it multiple times? Absolutely. I mean, that's part of what it means to me to be a Christian and a theist. Could I prove that? I don't know how. But it's almost, I want to flip the perspective, and maybe this is dangerously close to deism in some way if I don't say it carefully, but to say that instead of imagining God intervening at certain moments, imagine God upholding at all moments, through creation, through the laws of nature, and more that we'd struggle to measure with science. I mean, that's the way that I would see the history of life. Gould's thought experiment's a lovely one, isn't it? Because I don't think anytime soon anybody would be in easy reach of asking it. Although now that I think about that, I think about these wonderful experiments in bacterial evolution that look for repeatability. Let me just be clear that I align with Simon Conway Morris, saying there's far more direction and purpose in the universe than traditional evolution was teaching me as an undergrad, and that the evidence is clear on that. But again, one person could say that's more of a deistic argument, and another person could say, no, that's just where it begins, and it goes on and up from there at every moment of sustenance.
Well said, Steve. Let's move on to Marika, and then John Wood after that.
Thank you very much, Randy, for hosting this discussion and also for the paper. I've been utterly fascinated by these things because Abiogenesis, before I read those articles, the night before I received the first article, I was at a dinner party, about the last one before the COVID lockdown, where one of the medical people averred that viruses were not living. And of course, everyone's immediate response was, well, then why are we putting so much effort into killing them? And that was my, why should I think about this? And then immediately the article showed up. I didn't write my question out because being fifth in position, you kind of want to pick up on some things that people have said. But my original real reaction to this idea of simplification and complexity was that coming from an environmental management and information science background, I think maybe I'm using the word complexity in a little bit different way. Because to me, complexity is not the same thing as complication or a whole bunch of simple things stacking up next to each other, sort of crystallizing. But rather, complexity involves a continuous process. I think someone else already said this, of energy interchange, so that a complex system doesn't just have a lot of stuff in it. It has a continuous interaction at different scales, at different time periods, and so on, between the various elements. And each element adapts to each other element. And of course, everyone else in the system, or every object else in the system, adapts to those adaptations. And so in that process, the entire system becomes complex, but also it's not simple in the sense that we could possibly even hope to control it in the scientific sense. I'm going to do this and this will happen. But it's certainly something that can be managed, that can be adapted to. And it seems to me that in a more theological sense, we're continually engaging in a process of discernment within the complex system, which to me is more complex the more it has life in it, and the more complex that life is, and the more different kinds of life we have, or the more different kinds of society or spirituality or whatever. Ideally, what we are doing is continually adapting and responding to some kind of energy input, which causes that continual introduction of new information. And I would point out that mathematically, at least, information content is notated as the negative of entropy. Right. And I certainly have not wrapped my mind around that, not being a thermodynamicist, though having taught high school physics and suffered through a few physics courses in my life. But it seems to me it's these processes, and particularly energy, where I find the theological hook for me. And I have very provocatively said to people that I think the Holy Spirit is, by definition, entropyless energy inputs and things. Now, that's entirely to be provocative. I'm not going to defend that statement.
That's a new one. That's a new one.
But I'm wondering, how would you respond to this more nuanced idea of what complexity is? It's not complication. Too often we tend to think of the tax system as complex. Yeah. It's not. It's complicated.
I mean, thank you so much for that question. I apologize. It was the one that I read minutes before this meeting. I think, but for whatever reason, it's sort of still going through my head to answer this, because you're so close to the core of what many people are objecting to here. There are others in the room who are trained in information theory who are like, well, complexity means some. I think the first thing I'm going to say is Randy's got a great article coming about just disambiguating different ways that we think about complexity, meaning, and Randy, why am I blanking? We really nailed this talking the other day, didn't we? Complexity, meaning, and information.
Because it's all complex, that's why.
It is. And so I really will try to answer your real question then, Veronica, in a moment. And I just want to say, first of all, I want to reiterate this point. I'm calling out my field, my abiogenesis colleagues, secular, for not understanding this well and for misinterpreting, in layman's terms, what is complex and thinking, well, that's what complexity is that everyone's talking about. It's just this idea. We're talking about order out of chaos. Yes. They're very good on the order. They're very bad on the chaos, traditionally, because they've got distilled water and 3 reagents and they want to get something more complex. And that just isn't the right question. It's not the right way to think about this. We need to see a collapsing of that Brownian randomness into the order is really the only question that we should be addressing, I think, in abiogenesis.
That's a great statement, concise statement of what you're really after. Right?
Thank you. Yeah. And I do just want to hang on this one thing that to me, I just saw Paul Davis the other day, I mean, way more famous than me, way more influential, just arguing something where I can't understand where the logic is. That clearly complex biological organisms, there's a mystery as to where the information comes from. Bless him, Randy got me involved with ASE back in 2011, asking that question, saying, well, look, from my perspective, the way I was trained, it's always been the environment. The universe has so much information in it that really, when we, if I can be blunt about this sort of abiogenesis thing, I'm interested in the origin of adaptive evolution as being the origin of life. Because if you give me that, that is the process that extracts the information, the meaningful bit, from an endlessly more complicated universe. And that's what I'm after here. And I just don't see enough of my colleagues getting that point, right?
Excellent. All right. Let's move on to John Wood. There, I lost you. Where are you, John?
Hey, Randy.
Okay, there you go. All right. Let's hear from your question.
Well, this is delightful. Even thank you for your articles. These 2 articles, my day job keeps me a little busy, so I haven't been able to read them as closely as I'd like, but they're very stimulating.
Thank you.
And actually quite challenging. So I take your point here of challenging a narrow spectrum of disciplines. You're going after a particular question. That's one of the challenges in perspectives, is because we get these articles, they come out to all of us, and we're this interdisciplinary organization. We come from very different places with different assumptions and experiences. And so it's I've said this to Randy privately multiple times, just appreciate his leading, diving deeper, because this gives us a challenge or an opportunity, to continue this conversation.
Amen.
Do just shouting at a piece of paper that's in front of you, or right? Like, you don't get my point. Well, to that, abiogenesis and physical death and dying are actually closely related in many conversations, or in some. I'd actually like to see it, and your paper really is helpful in getting at this, drawing attention to life and complexity in what I see as a very novel way. It's an interesting rhetorical reversal, as you've said here, of the emphasis and the situational character of our descriptions of living things over against non-living. Of course, this really got my mind going. So as I was reading your opening sentence, I said, it says, living things we're often taught to perceive are more complex than our non-living environment. And then you move to complexity. And of course, where I am situated, then you moved away and past this question of being and non-being, question of vitalism and materialism, and all of that, maybe helpfully so, right? You can't cover everything, but I just would like to explore that, because it seems that dealing with death in the context of emergence of being, the significance of non-being and of being, is essential when we're talking about emergence of life. And I know this takes the turn to the philosophical, but for us as biologists, it becomes very, ecologists in particular, and I think of death ecologically, and I see it from cells to the biosphere. I see it operating there. And so this life-death exchange and interaction is a key part of this, it seems to me.
It was such a beautiful question. And I think Randy and I were kicking ourselves, saying how we hadn't even thought of that before you raised it. And it is so interesting, isn't it? Let's start with some easy stuff. I think everybody here kind of disagrees that if we talk in terms of order and disorder, we're on the home ground together, right? So the dying is somehow a return to disorder. I get that. I think I've never gone near death as a biologist to study it scientifically because it is so complicated, isn't it? What does it mean for us to die as conscious, even spiritual beings when our cells carry on living or dividing at different rates and at different durations after our collective? Yes, I mean, non-being is not a trivial issue. Maybe there's my get out clause, is to say, actually, the closer you look at death of a human being as a biologist, the less it becomes an easy black and white concept. And that if anything, we're sort of talking about the symmetrical other half of that. Because human beings took a very long time to arrive through this algorithm. And even now, when we die, we can see, gosh, yes, bits of humans last longer than other bits. And it's sort of a rapid undoing of something that we're saying maybe took 3.5 billion years to go in the other direction in the first place. It's not trivial, is it?
It's not. And it struck me in graduate school as I'm over these living organisms, insects, aquatic insects, in a petri dish, and I'm taking the heads off of living, and I'm killing them one after another by the hundreds every day. And they don't want to die. And they're just insects. And there's something about life that resists that transformation that I was executing there on them. And I thought somehow the abiogenesis discussion, it wants to go to just chemicals and processes, and yet this behavioral piece, this motivational, and you just see it everywhere as you move up and down the scale.
And the chemical or cellular definition of death, I mean, yes, it's horrendous, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. At what point do we call it death, right?
But so the question is, does that help us think about how life emerges? Because is it enough just to have a complex of biochemistry going? If you just got the right things together, that they would sort of self-assemble, or is there something that we're missing, we're not seeing? Again, it's this mechanism vitalism, dilemma.
And I'll be honest, it's sort of I could claim it was logical, and I could spend ages explaining why, but I'm anti-vitalism. I don't see a missing essence, a missing something. I think that's a lot of what this argument is. If you can provide adaptive evolution, then so much of what we associate with the complexity of life is an extraction of useful bits of information from a chaotic universe. And death is sort of the unraveling of that process. We no longer respond to the environment. I'm sorry, Randy, please.
Yeah, no, John, I just want to thank you for bringing that up. I think that's superb, and I hadn't thought about that symmetry of non-life to life and then life to non-life. And I think we must all agree that at the point of death, and many of us have been at the bedside of loved ones who have passed on to glory, and I think we have to admit that the structure and the chemical arrangement orderly remains the same, and yet there's a difference. And as Steve said, quantifying, articulating that distinction is non-trivial and is beyond the scope of this program. But John, your encouragement for us all to give thought to that is greatly appreciated. Thank you.
Could I just give one more thing that I thought of? It's very quick, I promise. But it just struck me as, I don't know, ironic or amusing that were I Richard Dawkins, I would be throwing around words like immortality, but I'd be applying them to the genetic material. And that gets very non-trivial very quickly because, of course, it does mutate and adapt and change. And yet there they were, Selfish Gene, Blind Watchmaker, all of his books, immortal.
Right.
But he's taken it down to a sort of material level that is just something else altogether.
Excluded everything else. That's right. Yeah. So, all right, let's move on to the raised hands. And the first one that I will really interpret as a raised hand is Joe Lechner, who sent us a note at 2:03 p.m., which means we didn't have time to read it in advance. So, Joe, I see you there. excuse me, would you like to ask your question?
Randy, as a chemist, I have difficulty grasping your notion that the contents of a living organism, which are mostly 6 elements that you list, somehow simpler than the whole rest of the biosphere. Admittedly, it is simpler for the student of chemistry to only have to keep track of the valences of 6 elements instead of 100 or so, not all of which are available to the biosphere. But the introductory lecture in organic chemistry begins with a statement that there are tens of thousands of known compounds without carbon and tens of millions of known compounds with carbon. So certainly the organic realm is more complicated, not simpler than the mineral realm. And that doesn't even take into account the biochemical subset, which I suspect is even more complicated than the non-biological organic compounds. If you consider the possible DNA sequences, the possible protein sequences, surely the contents of a living organism are more complicated than what's outside. How do you respond to that?
Thank you, Joseph. Right. So I think the first point is that there's plenty of carbon in the non-living universe. So everything that you say about carbon, I mean, one of the things we sort of dig into a little bit in the paper, rather tongue-in-cheek, is to say, watch out for organic chemistry, let alone biochemistry, because those are social constructs. It's not like the only carbon you find is inside living cells, and therefore anything that you could build with carbon is part of the non-living universe. So it comes back to your earlier point that it's only a subset of that we're finding within cells. So much of what we're after then is a filtering process on one side of which we find life. Life is filtered universe, right? And that's the key sense in which we're arguing it's worth thinking about it as a simplification. It is a filtered subset of the non-living universe. Now, in terms of possibility space, how many DNA sequences are there? Yes, but we've sort of shifted our terms a little bit there, haven't we? To what is possible, not what is material, and we can count. But again, none of those sequences are impossible in a non-living universe. They're just extremely unlikely. And that's where we sort of circle back on this idea that natural selection does tell us how we bring about specific sequences of incredible non-randomness over time by extracting environmental cues. Because wherever you extract one that leads to more success reproducing or surviving, that's what becomes the basis for the future. And you iterate that algorithm and you can produce these immensely long coded sequences. I mean, that would be a standard argument for evolution. But I think at the beginning, it's just this idea that there is nothing inside of a cell that could not be outside of a cell. There really is sort of no material basis on which it's different, except less, right? When you get inside life. I mean, would you like to respond? Have I misunderstood?
Well, I wonder if the dichotomy simple/complex is supposed to be related to the thermodynamic concept of low entropy/high entropy. When you use words like filtering, you're implying to me that something, whether it's a living cell or a non-living process, something is extracting materials from the universe and selecting them and concentrating them. So entropy is decreasing inside that cell when you do that. And yet you're saying that's simplification. Well, high entropy is simple, low entropy is complex.
So, I mean, this is where so many of these questions circle, and I don't I think I've probably carelessly created confusion. I want you to be aware that the words have very different meanings in different disciplines. And to all of you trained in information theory, what you've just said is obvious. But there are so many people who are using those words, especially in abiogenesis, to not mean that are trying to build up to the macromolecules of life from simple constituents, rather than trying to filter down from the chaos of the universe to get what life is. RNA is such a popular target, and it's a very unlikely, to me, implausible product of abiotic chemistry. So much effort to try to take smaller and, by many reckonings, simpler molecules and cause them to build up to give you RNA. And I just think that's a wrong-headed question by people who don't understand what you've just said.
Right.
And really alluding to macromolecules here. I was just addressing a concept of 6 elements inside the cell, 90 to 100 outside the cell. A selection.
Joe, I think that's a...
Yes, are selected out of all of the available elements. That's the opposite of dilution.
Well, I think that's a key question, Joe. But I think I want to say that when we talk about simplification, we're not just saying take anything in the non-living universe and it is clearly more complex than any part of the living piece. That's not the understanding of the terms. Talking about simplification, we're talking about the environment, but the immediate context and environment from which simplification occurs. And I don't think we have time or the format here to really expound on that. And as Steve said, we hope to expound on that in more detail later. But it's a tough issue, and anyway, it's a good discussion. So thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah.
So let's proceed to the raised hands. I see your raised hands, and I will proceed in order here. And I'd like to welcome Peter Busse here. And many of you will know that he wrote the article that precedes this article in the journal, an excellent article. Thank you very much, Peter. Glad to have you join us. I presume you're in the UK right now, so it's a little later, but you may ask your question now.
Thank you very much. This may follow on really from what's just been said, but you seem to be saying that the process that can generate life is in some sense simpler than all kinds of random processes that could take place with these chemicals. But of course, there could be many, many, many simple processes that take place with a given set of chemicals. I think it's remarkable that any one of these could generate life. So isn't there a kind of hidden complexity in selecting or allowing to happen that one simple process out of zillions, which gives rise to life? A sort of hidden complexity here.
I mean, thank you so much for a question that deserves more thought than I've got time to give it if I reply now. But I can't help reflecting on some of what's been said earlier, that it all depends which way you look at it. If there is one process that produces this, let's just say thought experiment, there's just one. And, at some point that becomes natural selection, but clearly here we're talking about something chemical prior. If there was one that had this effect and it led to life, well, that's the one that inevitably would be at the root of life. It would be 100% likely to be the one, right? So you can look at it from one end and say, well, there's only one out of so many. But from the other end, of course, that was the one that got the ball rolling. And then it just continues, and all the way through to the tremendous non-randomness of a modern DNA sequence in a human being. It's the process of natural selection that has constantly been filtering out the environmental cues that allow that version of the macromolecule to succeed better than competitors and go on and so forth. To me, yeah, sorry, maybe I get off topic towards the end there, but I like what you're saying, but it's sort of just which way you look at it. Somewhere within this, if there's one process that inevitably gets it going, then it's inevitable. If you look at them all together at the beginning, then it's one out of zillions, right? maybe I completely misunderstood. Randy, rescue me or make sure that others have time as well if I'm not doing very well with this.
Okay, thank you. That'll do for now.
All right, yeah. So we'll pursue that, but I would echo Steve's view that this is something that deserves a lot more attention, and I thank you because it's tough to get our heads around it. But let's move on. We've got a lot of people here wanting to ask questions. So Chris Farragher, good to have you with us here, and do that, and then next will be Matthew.
Hi, thanks so much, Steve. My question may be a little premature, but and Steve, as you know, I'm a philosopher, not a scientist, so I'm more familiar with these kind of discussions in a philosophy of science or philosophy of biology context than the actual details that you as scientists work in on a daily basis. But supposing, so your paper went through the peer review process. You had a couple peer reviewers, and they gave their comments, and we all know the usual process. So now here we are in this group, which is basically another peer review process. And so you come out of this, later today with 15 questions, whatever, and you take away, what you want, and then. So my question is kind of, where do you go next with this? But my question is actually broader than that, because what struck me in reading this is that this is actually an important perspective. I mean, in my reading of the philosophy of science, philosophy of biology, literature, it's all about complexity. I mean, I don't remember reading anything in there about processes of simplification. I mean, it's not a word I come across.
Right.
And so what struck me about the article is actually this is a potentially really important insight, not just to bring to the ASA community, but actually to bring to the broader scientific community and the broader philosophy of science community, anyways, where I tend to live. And so I'm just wondering how you do that.
How do we bring it to a broader audience? Sorry, just one more time, recap for me the how.
It strikes me that your key insight here around simplification, I mean, you've got all the correct technical questions being asked around definitions and different disciplines, how different disciplines perceive, issues of complexity and simplification and so forth. I'm kind of stepping up a level above all those important questions and just saying the very notion of simplification as part of these life-generating processes and other generating processes in the universe is something I don't see discussed in the literature. And so it seems to me there's an important idea there that actually needs to be taken, once you've refined it all from these discussions, needs to be taken out beyond the SA community, but as a genuine contribution to the wider scientific community.
Thank you.
And just wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
Yes, and let me be respectful of time and other questions and say you're so right, aren't you? I'm trying to fit it in over this summer to rewrite both parts 1 and part 2 for a purely secular journal. I think I'm close to having part 1 rewritten. The challenge there, but I think it is instructive for all of us here and the conversation we've just had, is that I was going to say half and half, it isn't. One fraction of abiogenesis researchers are like, well, that's obvious, there's nothing new there. Why would you publish this? And the other people are like, the other fraction, like, this is utterly wrong. You can't possibly publish this. And I think many of us have been there as researchers, and I'm trying to think how to navigate it. And so much of it comes down to language. It all depends how you've been trained to perceive the word complexity. Maybe I can now answer Randy's question. If I wanted one message from this paper to take away, what would it be? Watch out for that word. Because whatever you think it means, be aware that it means very specific, different something to other people. And yet we talk as if we all know what we mean by it, right?
Well said, Steve. Okay, let's move on. A lot of people are wanting to ask questions here. Matt, you're next.
Well, my question doesn't have anything to do with complexity or simplicity, so that should be a good break.
Thank you.
As I read the paper, it seems that much of the arguments that you lay out hinge on the using natural selection as we understand it in the context of biogenesis and applying it to chemical processes of abiogenesis. And in fact, you say, this is quoting from one part in the article, if living organisms are inseparable from the non-living universe, then so is the process of natural selection, which of course is true, but I think it's a great leap to say that processes of natural selection exists outside of biogenesis. It's could be true, but it's highly speculative in my opinion. So my question is do your arguments hinge on that assumption that natural selection, as we understand it in the context of biogenesis, works similarly in the processes of abiogenesis?
Thank you, Matthew. What a wonderful, wonderful question. I get it completely, and if I need to unpack it for others to join in, but I think you're right on the money here. In writing it up for the secular audience, I realize again, there's a phrase there I need to be so careful about. I think you're right that I'm arguing there is something like selection, which is what gets us to what we label as natural selection. So it's the evolution of evolution. But chemical evolution is not the same, but I would perceive it in a Venn diagram as being natural selection as the inner circle. We know those rules so well. Ever since Darwin, they've been studied mathematically, empirically. We know natural selection. There's shells around that of selection-like processes where the rules are a bit different, and we have a woefully incomplete literature on that. Chemical evolution fascinates me, but to even imply that there are two things, chemical evolution and biological evolution, is a gross misunderstanding, because this half is a whole bunch of things. But I mean, in the secular version, we're talking about deoxypeptides, these sort of strange heterogeneous polymers that can contain some amino acids, but are mostly another type of molecule. But the amino acids gradually replace them over time because that is stabler and it's an inevitable outcome of physics. That's one example where you're seeing something that actually has some real hallmarks of natural selection, but has nothing to do with cells or biology or the rules as we know them. In fact, the real sticking point for me as I finished work yesterday, working on this manuscript a little bit, was to say a lot of the literature that says what you require for natural selection has sort of begged the question, because it's assuming a set of rules, a digital polymer, 4 states at each thing, and then we can talk about error catastrophes and what's necessary to... When you change the rules, we don't have a mathematical language for that. Some of the most interesting stuff I've seen recently is a guy called David Baum at Wisconsin, who is looking to say, you know, where else we see something a bit like natural selection, but not the same, the rules have changed. It's ecology, where species are interacting over time and can change patterns. And he's extracting rules there and applying them in his laboratory to chemicals to say, well, can we see some rules here that give us a new language to say what would be the steps by which you get to natural selection as we know it? Matthew, does that work for you at all?
Yeah. I think I hear what you're saying. It sounds like you require at least some aspects of natural selection in order to really draw out the argument that you're making. And so if there was a hypothesis for abiogenesis that for key steps of that process did not include natural selection, would that be kind of more challenging for the argument that you're making?
Yes. And in fact, that's exactly where I think the field has gotten stuck, is looking even secularly for a very, very unusual something to happen. And I think that's the wrong thing to look for. I think a sequence of steps that lead up to the rules that we know and characterize it as natural selection is exactly what we're after. Sorry, Randy, you wanted to...
Right. No, that's excellent. Exactly what I wanted to say. And I wanted to add that in a way, simplification is just another way to describe selection, or as Eric Chasen calls it, selective elimination. He prefers that term to natural selection. And so you have a selection of a simpler subset of a more complex set of possibilities. That's another way to look at it. All right, let's move on. We got more. I'm not sure I know your name. Pumpernickel, is that your name here? It's your turn.
Yeah, that's my Zoom name. I am Fred Cannon. I'm a professor.
Oh, yes. I recognize you now. I thought I saw your face.
Pennsylvania State University here. My field is environmental engineering, and I want to build on your idea about distilled water. So in environmental engineering, a lot of people do experiments in distilled water. In 125 referee journal papers, we did not use distilled water, and I think that made a lot of difference. So,
amen.
I think, and maybe you all can comment on this, sometimes we read the Bible in distilled water. And that's not how to read the Bible. There was a lot of chaos going on when Moses wrote Genesis, for example, and so on like that. But what are God's miracles? Sometimes, not always, but sometimes they're the right event at the right time for the right audience, all at in the right condition. So the statistics of all those rights adding up makes it pretty improbable that it happened. Why did the frogs come when they came in the Nile Valley when Moses rose his stick? Things like that. Okay. Start of life. The right chaos with the right chemicals in the right jug at the right time all adds up to something improbable. What was the right chaos?
Thank you. I'll keep it short because I don't know, nor does anyone, and these are the right questions.
That's right.
But my point would be that
you
I think
the right question.
Thank you. Oh, then I better not say what I was going to say next, which I think that's the wrong question, right? I think what I'm arguing is that's what a lot of my colleagues have been looking for in secular science of abiogenesis for a long while. What was the right combination? I'm sort of with this guy, Jeremy England, a bit. I think it sort of harkens back to a question that I wasn't doing very well with a moment ago. Somewhere within that, whatever it was the inevitable answer, and that's what we should be after. I don't think we're after a very special microenvironment, a very special collection of circumstances that has characterized this field for quite a long time. I suspect there is an inevitability that we're sort of tracing back, peeling the onion one layer at a time until well, that's where it began. And that's a very different paradigm from trying to figure out the exact right combination that happened somewhere in the universe that we now call home.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Does that make, yeah, I'll stop there because I don't want to just go on and on, but that was sort of my counterpoint.
Yeah, I think that's true. And may I just add that, as many of you have heard me say many times, that considering probabilities retroactively of events in the past is fraught with danger. And one way to look at it is every single event that we observe and experience can be calculated as being so improbable that it didn't happen, which we know is false. So it's difficult. You have to take these different views. Okay, we're time is fleeting, and a number of people still wanting to ask questions. So be sure to keep your questions brief, concise. Maybe we can get all the questioners in there. Paul Arvison is next. Paul, good to see you.
Great. Good to be here with everybody. And Steve, good to see you again,
Back at you.
At University of Maryland. And this is a book I got from Cyril Panamparuma back in the day. That was 50 years ago when he was one of the pioneers in studying the origin of life at the University of Maryland. So what goes around comes around. It's kind of great to see that. And I hope we can see you in a local chapter meeting again sometime soon.
Thank you.
Now, my question actually dealt with a critique of some of the the ideas in your report, but I submitted my critique to the editor, and Jim Peterson has already agreed to publish it in the next issue of the journal. And so perhaps some of you others here may also want to contribute something to the discussion in print in the journal. So I won't pursue that further here, but just to suggest that a little bit of it has to do with another book that you're probably well familiar with, Jacques Monod's book, A Chance and Necessity, where he talks about what he called gratuity, this concept of gratuity, which I would call decoupling, the decoupling of information from chemistry, which seems to me like, I don't want to use the word complexity or simplicity. I just don't think those are the right words to use. But there's some kind of a break in the logic, and this, of course, is referred to as the second secret of life. It wasn't mentioned in the article at all, but it seems to me that it certainly should be part of the discussion. So that brings up that question, and I don't think we need to pursue it here because we're going to carry this on in print. Thank you.
We are, and thank you for your letter. We have enjoyed responding. So thank you very much, Paul.
Yeah, and Jim has accepted the response, and it will be in print. And as he said, we can hopefully discuss it in the future. So thank you, Paul. Bill, you're next. Please unmute yourself. That would help a little. There we go.
Now you can hear me.
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay. So I want to, this is sort of a thought it's still rough. So I just want to introduce perhaps a challenge, or at least a pause in this a notion that this separation between living and non-living is in some sense more continuous than we might think. And the way that I want to introduce that is by at least introducing the notion of mereology, between the relationship between parts in a living organism as opposed to a non-living organism. And I want to suggest that the parts of a living organism are related in a much more intimate way that's not reflected in any notions of atomism or any notions of typical definitions of complexity, which are simply counting number of connections and things like that. And that has to do with the fact that the parts cannot, I don't know how to say it. It's their livers relate to human bodies in ways different than sodium atoms do in salt. Let me just put it that way. And the sodium atoms are sort of separable, substitutable, and there seems to be no necessity of the connection. And so anyway, that's basically my question. It has to do with more of an exploration of the mereology of existing between living in living organisms and parts as opposed to non-living, and whether this qualitative distinction is not captured in our notions of complexity.
Thank you. And just really briefly, so many of these questions, it's not like I'm sort of got an answer. These are discussions, and I'm so grateful for you being here, and I'm so grateful for a journal that allows a provocative paper to stimulate discussion. I don't think this is the full answer to what you've said, but I think that point about Dawkins and stars stands. We need to watch out more in my community, Abiogenesis, for the parochialism of counting which connections matter. A star is very, very simple and lacking in meaningful connections if you're a biologist. Quite the reverse if you're an astronomer, right? The parts you see and count. I think what we've left out of the equation again and again throughout the history of science is the subjectivity of the scientist. And Dawkins to look at a star and say, well, look, there's nothing much there worth talking about, is a biologist statement. And it doesn't stop everything he's talking about in biology being useful. But how we count what we see in order that we count it, I think is something that we've acted as if there's a level of objectivity there, which I would like to at least push at a bit in my community. Thank you, Bill. I mean, yeah, that only begins to get at what you said.
Well said. Okay. Next we have Cy Gard. Hello, Cy. Please unmute there. That goes. Okay.
Hi, Steve.
Hi, Cy.
I read your article 2 or 3 times, and each reading was helpful, and this has been really helpful because I now think that what you're proposing is very interesting, the simplification idea, especially the order out of chaos. And I think there's a lot there. For example, what you just said about RNA, I completely agree with. But I do have a question. It's not at the higher level that almost all these questions have been. This is a fairly technical one. And it has to do with, it kind of follows on the question that Matt asked before about the question of natural selection outside of life. And that, what people often forget about evolution is that it requires natural selection and it requires mutation and variation. But the other thing it requires is very accurate self-replication.
Right.
And you mentioned that in your paper, and then you refer back to what you had said about that in the earlier paper. And you do admit that if we don't have replication with slight variations, we have a vicious circle. And then you discuss the idea, as you already said just now, that there is natural selection in outside of life. But my question is, there may be natural selection, but is there accurate self-replication, which is critical for the evolutionary process. And if
Thank
there
you,
is,
Si. Oh, sorry, please keep. Thank you. And I just wanted to say that your letter really sort of called attention to this in a great way on part one. We appreciate it. Okay. I want to go back to that Venn diagram idea. I don't want to call it natural selection outside of life. And if I did, I was careless and I was wrong. But there's something like natural selection. And strangely enough, I think we're back to an idea of a continuum, that there isn't a binary, natural selection and other. There are things that are more and more and more like natural selection. I think we're arguing that natural selection as we know it is an outcome of evolution because it's so efficient. So many of the things you pointed to, so many of the things that Paul points to in his letter, that we're looking at components that have been selected to be good little players molecularly in this process of natural selection. But that's the sort of innermost circle of a Venn diagram with things like natural selection going on around it. A really deep comment that maybe goes back to something that I think a couple of people have sort of hinted at here. I'm no trained in a philosopher, but I think the real problem is our tendency as humans to attach labels to things. Oh, that is natural selection, that isn't. It immediately creates an idea of a dichotomy that I think we need to challenge. And if we saw more of a graduated series or even a continuum, I think would be a lot closer to understanding how the components of natural selection as we find them came into being in the first place. Does that do anything for you at all, Si?
Well, I think what you're saying is that self-replication at high accuracy is part of the natural selection process.
Part of the outcome, exactly. Yeah. It had to be, because that's a better way of doing it and would outcompete things that did it less well, right? Right. So that, to me, hints there's layers before that get you to that, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, we do know, and I want to be clear about this, it isn't just speculation that there are things like selection out there. I mean, people have played with ideas of memes for ideas that transmit and evolve. There are endless sort of examples isolated, and what they add up to is anyone's guess, but of chemicals that sort of outcompete one another because they lead to a more stable state, a more persistent memory. I think that's the territory this field needs to be digging in, to see a series of steps that get us to something so wondrous that we've accidentally labeled it as being unlike all other chemistry, right?
Mm-hmm. Very good, Steve. Thank you. Daryl, it's great to see you, part of our program here. How are you doing? Your turn.
Doing well, thank you. Randy, this is really a question for both of you. And so the question is, so both in this discussion and in the article itself, it was fairly brief, your discussion of the theological ramifications. And so I'm wondering if maybe either or both of you wouldn't make some comments about the theological ramifications. So why was this particular article in the Perspectives on Science and Christian Faith? What's the relevance here with respect to theology? And I'd love to hear you say a few things about that.
Thank you. And let me be brief, because I need to remember I'm not trained as a theologian. I'm just a Christian and I can give you testimony. I think order out of chaos is written very clearly into Genesis account and is a deep theme about what separates all that is of God from things that aren't of God. As a child, I remember just sort of a moment of realizing that one of the hallmarks of evil is it tends to destroy itself, whereas life goes in the other direction when it's of God. Things build up to something. Order out of chaos matters theologically. The only other thing I want to say before handing on to Randy is that Emily was really the theologian for both part one and part two, at least as far as I'm concerned, and wrote something beautiful, which I found very true to what I believed, but the journal asked us to remove it. And it was looking through more of a Franciscan lens at the presence of God within nature, not denying the special relationship of human beings to their creator, but to see this sustaining act, moment to moment, of God as being part of what it means to be alive. Randy, what do you want to add or say?
I'd say amen to that. And I think it's well said, and thanks for the question, Daryl. Here,
thank you.
There are a number of directions on the theological implications from the perspective is, one is, I think as Christians, we're so steeped in the notion of the miracles that Jesus performed that we have a strong bias towards wanting to see miraculous events in the origin of life. It may be, I don't know. My guess is we would never really be able to verify it or that. But I think what Steve is helping us do here is to look at the question of the origin of life from a new angle, a new perspective. Shed your biases here a little bit. And instead of demanding that God must have done a miracle, surely, because that's just a great, grandiose way of creating, it may be a much more elegant process. Was a way in which he created this universe that develops under, not a deism here, but under some kind of a guidance. And Peter Bussey's article deals with that to some extent. And if you haven't read it yet, go back and do that. But there is continued involvement with God in a marvelous process. And our attempt here is to try in different ways to articulate and understand, well, not fully, but understand from several different aspects just what might have happened. We will probably never have the particular route to be able to identify the chemical processes and the synthetic pathways of chemistry. And it may not be the right thing to pursue that. That may be a dead end, and that may be blinding us to the bigger picture of what's going on. And so as Steve is encouraging us to do, is to look at the origin of life, not as the origin of eukaryotes or whatever we're familiar with now in all its glory, but rather a continuum of events that we don't even know how to recognize life versus non-life in great detail. And so let's kind of take a novel look. And the whole paper here, I believe, is designed, as Steve said, to stimulate new thinking, new ideas, new publication. We have not ended the discussion, their ideas. We encourage many of you to consider this and publish some ongoing articles, please.
I might just add that to me, one of the most important things, which hasn't been discussed, but nonetheless that I think emerges from the paper, which I think is a very important paper theologically, and that is you use the word continuation. I would also use the word connectedness, which runs all the way through this. And it seems to me that one of the biggest tasks, given that we have perhaps artificially and maybe are still dealing with the ramifications of having classified organisms as distinct organisms, and thereby we think of that distinctiveness as we think of biology. When really what's most important about biology is in my opinion, the connectedness that exists.
Amen.
And we as Christians have not yet done a good job of thinking, I don't think anyways, about the real ramifications of that connectedness that is inherent in life, and which is running through this article. So the connectedness means that we ought not be thinking of ourselves in that isolated way that we so often have, and we still do to some extent. I know we're getting better at it, but nonetheless, the theological ramifications of the fact that we are a community of interacting parts, including the non-organic parts of our environment. And I think that's ringing through in the article, and probably the need to continue that theological ramifications of this are pretty important.
Please do. Amen. Yeah. God is in relationships, and we're still just beginning to stop and think what that might mean in the way you've said. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Daryl. I think connectedness is a great term here, and these papers really serve to emphasize the connectedness in time and the connectedness in space and connectedness with the environment, with each other. The theme of connectedness is critical here, and I think it's worth exploring. Our time is up. Chris, do you have a very quick comment there? You raised your hand again.
I was just going to add some other potential theological dimensions.
Very quickly.
One is simply this is a deeper understanding of God's creation. So it constitutes simply a fleshing out of the doctrine of creation, beyond just bringing the order out of chaos, that element at the front end of creation. It's just deeper articulation of the nature of creation, which by virtue of itself is an articulation of simply of the doctrine of creation to a greater depth. But in addition to that, where Paul tells us to think deep, think about these things, he talks about goodness and whatever's good, whatever's beautiful. The Greek word there is dianoia. And to translate it as to think about these things is a bit shallow. It really means to think deeply about these things. And so what strikes me in this paper is this is just a marvelous example of us thinking deeply about this creation, exercising the minds God has used us and called us to use to think deeply about God's creation. So just a couple elements to throw in there.
Thank you, Chris. We typically stop by 3:30. Is there anyone who has a burning question you just can't wait? If not, I think we'll wrap things up. And as Paul pointed out, and there will be further print discussion in the September issue and hopefully in future issues. But please consider avenues with your local chapter, with other venues to continue discussions of this sort. This should not be limited in our modes, but I know Steve and even Emily would be willing to participate as possible in other venues to be able to do that. And John, are you asking to give a final word or very quickly?
Just to shout out to Jim Peterson, his editorial work on perspectives. Our editors going back, Ari Leaguewater and Jacques Haas and earlier, the quality of the journal articles is being brought to you today. And this kind of interaction and dialogue is what's essential for our day. It's what's gone missing. So just a privilege to participate in it. And it's essential, Steve, as you said, that all of us keep contributing into this rich conversation.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much, John. And with that, Steve, I would really like to thank you for an excellent conversation today, excellent article, and we look forward to future dialogue with you. And again, welcome as an ASA Fellow. It's great to have you in the group.
Thank you so much. I'm honestly humbled you'd all be here, and I just want to point out that last point about relationship. That's what it means to be here. I guess it's just repeating John, right? Thank you. Okay. It's been a pleasure talking.
Thank you very much, and we'll see you all next month on August 14. It is. Okay. Thank you, and farewell.
Thank you so much, Randy. Thank you, ASA. It's a delight to engage in such thoughtful spiritual dialogue on a Saturday afternoon.
You're most welcome.